Welcome back again, CHP listeners from all over the world. My deepest appreciation to all of you for tuning in to today's program. This is Laszlo Montgomery, and as advertised last episode, to kick off the Year of the Snake, back on the China History Podcast with me is Mr. Andrew Shaw. And as mentioned, as you probably surmised, Andrew's originally from England, and he walked away from the BBC as a reporter to move to China and become an apprentice in one of the many Jade workshops there. And after learning his craft, Andrew set up his own workshop and gallery and is the only foreigner working as a master carver in China. And I'll have links to documentaries about Andrew on YouTube. He's also appeared on China National TV talking about Jade. Andrew's written 2 books on Jade. Both were critically acclaimed, and one of them was a bestseller. And I invited him back to the CHP to talk about his latest book and all the history, legends, myths, and strange facts about Jade, known by many in China as the Tianshi, or Stone of Heaven. I also want to talk about Andrew's first book, Jade Life, which covers the history of Jade in China. The new book, just out, is called A Jade Treasury, and Andrew tells the story of Jade in a way I, for one, particularly enjoy. The book dishes up a fascinating survey of Chinese history from the Warring States period up until the present day, all told through the prism of Jade. So I'm happy to have him back again, and we're going to discuss the importance of Jade and its place in Chinese history and culture. Welcome back again, Andrew Shaw.
Good to be here. Good to speak to you again, Laszlo.
So, Andrew, tell us something about yourself. How is it that an Englishman ended up as a jade carver in China? It sounds like you had a great thing going with the BBC and a very comfortable life before you decided to give it all up and move to China to learn to carve jade.
Yeah, it seemed like that on the surface. I had a great job with the BBC. I had a great life in England. But I was getting a little bored with what I was doing. I'd been doing it for 15 years, travelling around the world, living out of hotel rooms, going to places where disasters and accidents were happening. And I wanted a change, so I took a 4-month sabbatical from the BBC, went to live in a hut on a beach in Thailand to write the great novel of the 20th century or 21st century. And during that time, I came across Jade. On my last days in Thailand, I travelled up to the north of Thailand, to Chiang Mai, where guns go in one direction and opium and jade comes in the other. And I came across a little jade carving workshop. And like many people who first touch a genuine piece of jade, I immediately fell in love with it. And when I got back to England and I went back to work for the BBC, Jade became something of an obsession. Any chance I had, I bought a book about jade, or I went and bought a piece of jade, or I travelled somewhere where I could get some jade. And in the end, I decided that the only thing I could really do if I wanted to live the life I wanted to live was to give up everything I had in England, move to China, the spiritual home of jade, and learn how to carve it and learn everything I could about it.
So your latest book is called A Jade Treasury. What was your inspiration to take such a project on?
To start with, there are lots of books about jade, thousands of books about jade in China and hundreds of books about jade in the West. But most of them are quite specialist. There's lots of academics who've written books about jades from ancient times, etc. And there's quite a few books which are quite dense for people who are already in love with jade, general interest books. But there's no book that's been written about jade just for somebody who might have a passing interest in it and might be interested in buying it and just seeing what jade is all about. All the books that have been published are for people who are fascinated by jade already and are quite dense and very difficult to wade your way through. So what I decided to do was 2 things. Write a book about the stories and legends surrounding jade, which are fascinating whether you like jade or not. And the other thing was, what I find in the West is that everything I read online about jade, even for those who are in love with it, a lot of it is just a misconception or misunderstood. The best example is one of the best jades in the world is mutton fat white jade. It's very, very famous. It costs more per gram than gold, and it's a wonderful jade to carve. It's beautiful to look at, and I keep seeing these adverts in the West for mutton fat white jade. Now, I live in China. I've been here for 15 years, and in my lifetime as a jade carver, I've only ever touched mutton fat jade twice because it's so rare. And that's just an example of how so many people in the West, even those who know about jade, believe they've got a piece of it or they're trying to sell it, and they just haven't. There's just so many misconceptions. I'm just trying to really dampen things down and give people an idea of the fascinating facts and legends behind jade and what it really is.
Many people associate jade with museums and ancient jades collecting dust and display cases. Is this the case?
It is the case, but people forget that it's still something that's alive and kicking in China. It's treasured in China. People in China love jade. There's 1 million people in China working in the jade industry. There are 2 small cities, one in Henan and one in Guangdong, with at least 150,000 people in each of those cities involved in the jade business. So if you come to China and you just get on a subway perhaps or walk down the road, you'll see at least 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 people wearing a piece of jade, whether it's a bangle, it's a pendant, a ring, etc. It's something that's part of Chinese history. It's part of Chinese culture. It's embedded in the DNA of people. When I first moved to China, I moved to the city of Suzhou, which has a population of about 10 million people, and there were 5,000 jade shops in that city. Now, that's quite an exception because it's a jade carving centre. But when you think that there's 200 cities with more than 1 million people in China, and each of those cities has moles, and in those moles there's always a jade shop or a jewellery shop selling jade. It's just something that's vibrant and living and alive in China. This is something that the British Museum, of course, has recognised. It came to China 7 or 8 years ago and bought modern pieces by master carvers, which they now display in the British Museum along the ancient jades that they've had for centuries.
Why is it? Why did jade in particular become so important to Chinese people and so associated with China?
Well, it's quite a complicated history, but basically to start with, once Chinese people 8,000 or 9,000 years ago started to change from nomads to an agricultural economy, the best tools they had, or the best tools any Stone Age man had, were made from jade. It was the nearest thing they had to metal. So the tribes that had jade tools and jade weapons would always conquer those tribes that didn't. So once they'd settled down, they started to fashion jade implements and jade tools, and it became an integral part of their culture. And the difference between China and other cultures is that when other cultures discovered metal, they threw away their jade and used iron and bronze and steel tools instead. In China, that wasn't exactly the case. By the time bronze and iron had been discovered, they treasured jade so much that it became used in rituals. It became used by the shamans and the emperors and the kings, etc., and they kept it. A great example of how important it was is at the beginning of jade culture in China 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, the colour of jade they treasured the most was a sort of celadon, a light green, because it was the same colour as the seeds they planted, which they relied on for the harvest the next year. This changed over time to white jade when the emperors sort of kidnapped jade and took it away from the priests and the shamans. And it just carried on from there. So it started as a tool, it started as a weapon, it moved into ritual, and it became something associated with emperors and something associated with everything that was noble and good. Confucius had a lot to do with this. 2,500 years ago, he associated it with everything that was pure and noble in mankind. And because Confucius was so important in Chinese culture and Chinese society, this has stuck since then. Confucius said, he said something along like, he said it embodied purity, intelligence, justice, loyalty, truth, sincerity, and chastity. He wrote that its iridescent brightness represented heaven, and being born of mountain and of water, it represented the earth. He also said the pure note which it gave forth when struck represented music. And this is very true. If you strike a piece of jade with another piece of jade, it gives off this pure ringing tone. It's how miners and jade hunters find jade in the wilds and in the deserts and when they go mining, etc. You strike a piece of a rock which just seems like an ordinary rock with a hammer, and it gives a beautiful ringing tone if it's jade and a dull thud if it isn't. So in that way, it's a really important part of Chinese society, culture, and has been for thousands of years. As I said, it's in the DNA, and I think one of the ways this is best illustrated is through idiom. Your excellent, most excellent podcast, you have a whole section on idioms. I myself, in my first book, have a whole section on jade idioms. And jade pervades idiom. I know about 60 jade idioms myself, and there are many more. Pure as jade and as clean as ice means to be pure and noble. Pure and noble. Words and jade of gold means you're having great advice. Friends are considered to be jade and gold. A beautiful woman is called a jade lady. A woman with a fair complexion and a slim figure is described as having jade bones and ice-white skin. In the West, we might say something like, you should treat your body like a temple. In China, you might often say, treat your body like a piece of jade, treasure it like a piece of jade. There's just so many. Like the Bible talks about beating swords into plowshares, but in the Middle Kingdom, here in China, they talk about exchanging weapons for jade and silk. And it just goes on. There's so many idioms. It's so much part of Chinese culture that it pervades almost everything. I suppose the best example, and this is best illustrated with a picture, is if you think of the two characters that represent the word China. The second character is the character of a piece of jade enclosed by four walls. So jade is so important to Chinese culture and to Chinese people that at subconscious level they've included the character for jade in the name for their country. And the more interesting thing about this is that this is the new Chinese, the simplified Chinese, and it was the communists who included the symbol for jade in the new language. So, for example, in 1949, when they took power, they wanted to get rid of everything that was traditional and old. But in the 1950s, when they were simplifying the Chinese language for common people, at some subconscious level, even they treasured jade, and they put the symbol for jade, the character for jade, in the new characters for the country that they just conquered.
One of my faves is always Pao Zhuan Yin Yu, cast a brick to attract a jade. You write about the myths and legends in China surrounding jade. Can you tell us a few of the good ones?
Well, I will go back to, I think, the beginning of the spring and autumn period. Your China History podcast, it goes in depth into the history of China. I do the same thing in a different way, but I do it through the lens or prism of jade, as you mentioned at the beginning. So one of my favourite stories is about the jade seal of the first emperor, which has a history of about 2,000 to 3,000 years, and it begins about 700 BC in the spring and autumn period in the kingdom of Chu, the realm of the Immaculate, where a common scholar living in a cave on a mountain one day is meditating outside his cave, and he looks up and a phoenix descends from heaven. Everything is pure stillness. The phoenix lands on a rock, stares at him, and then flies off again. Now, this is a scholar. He knows that the phoenix, which is a messenger from heaven, can only land on a piece of jade, which also comes from heaven, hence the name, the Stone of Heaven. So he leaps up, scrabbles this rock out of the earth. It's just a grey, dirty rock. Doesn't look like jade, but he's convinced it is. And he travels down to the king of Chu's palace. He walks there. He offers it to the king and said, "This beautiful piece of jade has come to you as a gift from heaven." The king doesn't believe him, thinks he's lying and just tried to con some gold out of him, ordered his left foot hacked off, and being her, this scholar goes back to his cave and throws the rock in the back and forgets about it. 10 years later, the king dies. Bir-en-Her goes back again and offers the new king the same rock. This king doesn't believe him. He cuts off his other foot, and the scholar stumbles or crawls back to his cave with his rock and forgets about it. Not long after that, this king dies, and a wiser king comes to the throne, and he believes Bir-en-Her. He orders his craftsman in his workshop to open this grey, dirty rock, and it turns out to be a wonderful, beautiful piece of jade. He has it carved into a bee disc, which is one of the most common forms of the spring and autumn period, and it becomes the symbol of the state of Chu, the realm of the Immaculate. Over the centuries, Chu becomes the most powerful state in the spring and autumn period. By the Warring States period, they've lost it. It suddenly turns up in the kingdom of Zhao, the land of late coming. The kingdom of Zhao suddenly starts to become more powerful and vies with Chu, the realm of the Immaculate, and Qin up in the northwest as the most powerful warring state. People come to believe that if you want to be the emperor, you want to rule all under heaven, you must have this bee disc, this Herrscher bee, in your possession, which is where the first emperor of China comes in. He knows that he must have it. He conquers the kingdom of Zhao. But instead of taking this bee disc into his possession, he lifts it up into the air, smashes it onto the floor, takes the largest piece, and orders his jade carving masters to carve a seal from it. This becomes the seal of the first emperor of China. And over the next 1,000 years, after the Qin dynasty has disappeared, every emperor, everybody who wants to be emperor, everybody who wants to rule on all under heaven, believes they must have this stone. It's mentioned in literature. For example, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The fight over this stone of heaven, this jade seal, is one of the central themes of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Which brings me back to literature again. If you think of the four great classics of Chinese literature, jade is a central theme or appears in three of them. Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the fight over the jade seal. In Journey to the West, which is we call Monkey, I think in the West, the Jade Emperor is a very major character, and in Dream of Red Mansions, the two main characters are, I think, named after pieces of jade, and one of them is born with a piece of jade in his mouth. So just an example of just how important it is to Chinese character, to Chinese literature and to Chinese culture. So this is the thing I love about this story is that it's true. It's as important and well known in China as the story of Arthur and Excalibur or the Holy Grail is in the West. But in the West, these are myths. In China, this is a myth based in fact. It's not fiction. This jade seal actually existed. It dominated Chinese politics for something like 1,500 years, whether in the form of the bee disc or in the jade seal of the first emperor of China. So things like that I find absolutely fascinating. And my other favourite story is very little known even in China. It's about the bodyguard of the first emperor of China, Ruan Wenzhong. He was a man supposed to be 7 foot tall, who by the age of 10 was the biggest man in his village, and his family couldn't afford to eat him. So when the first emperor's recruiters came round, they told them he was 16 years old, and over time he became the mightiest warrior in the Chinese army. And he became the bodyguard for the first emperor of China. And there's just so much about this story. And there is some basis in fact in it, because it's not only a story that's in China, but it's also a legend that's told in Vietnam under virtually the same name. Now, this bodyguard, when he died, the emperor decided he wanted him to protect him even after death, so he had a statue made of him and placed in front of his palace. Another legend is he didn't have one statue made of him, he had 16 statues made of him and placed on the wall, the Great Wall, protecting the emperor and the empire from the nomads of the north. And these 16 statues were placed on the Great Wall. And there is some evidence they did actually exist, because in the 3rd century AD, during the collapse of the Han Dynasty, one of the emperors is recorded as melting down the last statue, which was made of copper and bronze, to pay his troops. So it's stories like that about China and about... In a way, it's like I'm trying to tell the history of China through the lens of Jade. So like your podcast talks about the history of China in a purely historic form, mine concentrates on what I love, which is Jade, and it picks out Jade stories from the centuries, from the 7th century BC right up until the present day.
You sell your jade all over the world. Is there a difference between what Chinese buyers prefer and what Westerners like?
Absolutely, absolutely. Whenever a Chinese customer comes into my gallery or is looking at a piece of jade and considering buying it, he doesn't say, "Oh, isn't this beautiful?" He says, "What does it mean?" Yeah, this is how important jade is to Chinese people. Every jade pendant usually has a story behind it or a story that goes with it. It's based on a homonym or a rebus. It illustrates something. The best example, I think, for Western listeners about this would be the bat. Now, the word for bat is fu, and the word for blessing or luck is also fu. Yeah, so a bat in China is always associated with good luck and blessings and good fortune, unlike in the West, where the bat is a
vampire.
Yeah, with vampires, dark caves, etc. Even Batman is a sort of the dark hero, etc.
The Dark Knight.
It's considered a very lucky animal. So now you can get one pendant is 5 bats. Yeah, 5 bats in a ring around the circle for the symbol for long life, and so that's 5 bats or 5 blessings. And this is the 5 traditional Chinese blessings, which, if I can remember right, are a long life, many sons, a love of virtue, to die in your own bed, etc., etc., etc. So if somebody gives you a pendant with 5 bats surrounding the symbol for long life, it means they wish you that you have a good life, a long life, you have wealth, you have many sons, and good fortune throughout your life. And every single pendant that's carved in China has a meaning for Chinese people. So even at the basic level, like a cross, like when the Jesuits came here, they had crosses made out of jade. That's their symbol. Buddhists have a Buddha or a Guanyin, etc. So for Chinese people, it has to mean something. But for Western people, it's usually the beauty of the piece and the art behind it that matters more than the meaning behind it. I try to tell them the meaning behind it, but basically most of my Western customers, when they come into, they say, "Oh, isn't that pretty?" How much? Because good jade is very expensive. It's more expensive than gold. This isn't so important to Chinese people who seem to value jade far more than those in the West.
Yeah, you didn't limit the book to the Chinese passion for jade. You devote a whole chapter to the American heiress, Barbara Woolworth Hutton, the poor little rich girl, and the importance Chinese jade played in her, ultimately, tragic life. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, Barbara Hutton, a tragic life, came across her mother's corpse at the age of 4. Her mother had just committed suicide after reading in the paper about her husband having a dalliance and being photographed with a Swedish beauty, etc. The inheritor of a fortune of what is the equivalent of $1 billion today at the age of 21. Even before that, she was noted for her shopping, and she loved jade. From about the age of 14, she started to buy jade and love jade. The most expensive piece of jade jewelry ever sold at auction went for, I think it was $27 million US. It went about 10 years ago at an auction in Hong Kong, and it was a piece that was owned by her. But it was just a fraction of the jade that she had during her lifetime. She married 7 times. Every husband, except Cary Grant, the Hollywood actor, only married her for her money and left with millions. He refused to have any of her money and seemed to treasure and value her for herself, and stayed friends with her throughout her entire life. So her money was did her no good, but she loved jade. She had one of the most fabulous collections in the world. And I suppose another thing about that is what she illustrates is what happens to some people, like Barbara Hutton, and famous businessmen and people like myself. You touch a piece of jade, if it's well carved, and if you just fall in love with it. It sings to you. Your heart opens towards it. There are more and more people that I know in the West who are falling in love with jade. As they become more familiar with it, as China opens up, etc., there are more and more people who really love jade. One other thing I thought I'd like to mention about the Westerners and jade is how entwined the discovery of jade around the world is with Chinese jade lovers. So, for example, you're from the United States, you're from California. There's jade in California. There's nephrite and jadeite in California. There's a small jade industry in California. There's 2 festivals held each year, one at Big Sur and one in Monterey, where jade carvers from all over the world gather and start selling jade. These are recent events, but it was jade in California. It was first discovered by the Chinese. They didn't tell the Westerners they'd found it. They came over during the gold rush in the 1840s or 1850s, I think. They started looking for jade, and they found jade, looking for gold, but they found jade instead. They didn't really worry about the gold so much, but they sent the jade home because they treasured it so much. Some of the best jade in the world comes from Wyoming. It wasn't Westerners who discovered it. It was Chinese railroad workers in the 1860s. They didn't tell Westerners about it. They sent it all home. 70 years later, suddenly, the Westerners discover it. A lot of it had gone, and there was a sudden gold rush or jade rush in Wyoming as well. The same happened in Canada. It was railroad workers and gold prospectors from China who suddenly discovered tons of jade and started sending it home. And it wasn't until the 1950s that Westerners took advantage of this and thought, we could sell this to the Chinese. It's the same with New Zealand. I wouldn't say the Chinese discovered jade in New Zealand, but they do treasure it there. So it seems that wherever there's jade in the world, because there's such a big jade industry in China at the moment, China vacuums it up from wherever it is, whether it's from Central America, the Guatemalan jadeite, Canadian jade, Wyoming jade, jade from Yemen, jade from New Zealand, jade from Russia, etc. It all seems to find its way to the spiritual home of jade, which is China.
What should buyers of jade objects beware of at night markets and shops selling these bracelets and jade pendants? Buying jade has a reputation similar to pearls. Without any expertise, it's easy for non-experts to be fooled. I mean, I would never dare buy jade in a night market.
You're absolutely right. It's like, let me give you an equivalent example. Let's say you're in the United States of America and you're in California and you decide to go to a night market looking for something to buy, and you go to a stall and someone says, look, I've got a real diamond ring for you here. You can have it for only $100. Now, it's not going to be a real diamond, and it's not, it just isn't. You're not going to find a bargain like that at a night market. The same applies to China with jade. I give talks on jade all the time in China, and I get some really, really sad stories. One recent one was a German couple who came to a talk I gave, an elderly couple who'd just been touring around China, came up to me and showed me a ring they'd bought. And I said... and they asked me if it was jade. It wasn't. I had no idea what it was. It was a silver ring with some strange stone in it. And I said, where did you buy this? He says, we went on a tour in Beijing, and we went to this jade factory. And we went in, and I saw this ring, and I really liked it. And I said to the salesman, is that jade? He hesitated for a moment, and he said, yes, that's jade. He said, how much is it? And he said, $1,000. And I said, $1,000? And he hesitated again. Yes, $1,000. It was a silver ring with a strange stone, with a starting price of 1,000 renminbi, which is, and it was sold to a foreigner for $1,000. And But there's so many stories like that. I belong to Jade forums in the West and in China, and you quite often see a picture of a grinning Western tourist and a very, very happy Chinese jade carver standing next to each other, showing a piece of jade that they've sold him at some outrageous price. So, yeah, it's the same as you would in the West with diamonds. You go to a reputable place or a place where there's someone you trust. You're not going to find a bargain in a night market. What's the phrase? Even jia and even huo. Yeah? You get what you pay for, you know? So jade can be very expensive. The best master carvers, the 2 or 3 at the top of the tree, can charge as much as $250,000 for a small pendant. You know, that's right at the top of the tree. But you're not going to get it's like if someone offers you a diamond ring for $50, you're not going to believe them. So if someone offers you a jade pendant for $50, don't believe them either.
As far as jade relics go, from the first time I saw it in 1980. The Cuiyu Bai Cai in the Palace Museum in Taipei has always captivated me, and I could never forget it after all these decades. Are there any favorite jade relics in museums or private collections that you've had the pleasure to see?
I think I'd like to answer that in a slightly different way, which there is a lot of evidence that what's left in Taipei, in the palace in Taipei, isn't really the imperial treasure that Chiang Kai-shek said he shipped to China. There's an English lawyer called Lewis who's written a very, very persuasive book that says most of the treasures that he took from the Palace Museum in the Forbidden City, he sold off for personal gain or to help in his war effort. Now, that's not saying that all of the treasures were taken, but all of the jades, for example, that are on display in Taipei Museum, none of them have the imperial seal. Now, although jade carvers weren't allowed to put their own name to the pieces they carved in ancient times, all right up to the Qing dynasty, they usually had the imperial seal on them. And very, very few of the pieces that are in the museum do have that seal on them. The cabbage that you're talking about, marvellous piece of jade, marvellous to look at, absolutely fantastic piece of jadeite. That might be a rare exception, but there is a lot of evidence that many of the great pieces are now in private collections and museums around the world. My favourite recently is a piece in jadeite, which is about, 30, 40 foot long and about 8 foot high, which is a rendition in jade of a really famous painting of a river at a spring festival. It's valued at something like $100 million and on display in a national museum. And just the artistry and the skill involved in actually transforming a piece of jade. What he did was he sliced one rock of jade very thin into slabs and placed them next to each other like in one of a Chinese painting. And he transformed it into a painting. And it looks three-dimensional. It's absolutely marvellous. I spent hours just examining how he'd done it.
Where is it? What museum?
It's not in the Forbidden City. It's in the National Museum in front of it on the left as you're looking at Mao's tomb. I can't remember the name of the museum. And it's just absolutely amazing. The skill that's involved and the imagination in finding a piece of jade of the right hue and colour of such length, slitting it into slabs and just transforming it into a painting. The skill involved is immense, amazing. Something that I could only ever aspire to.
Is jade still being mined in Khotan, out in Xinjiang, or has that already been picked clean after so many centuries?
It's still being mined. The licenses, I think, have been revoked recently because the 70-kilometre stretch of the White Jade River, all the way from Khotan itself to the Kunlun Mountains where the jade actually originates, is like a building site. It's been bulldozed up. It's rented out in plots to people who want to mine for jade, and they go in with 2 bulldozers into the small plot they're allowed, and they dig and they dig and they dig until they find jade. So most of the jade has now disappeared. So the really good quality, high quality white jade, not the mutton fat white, just a really, really beautiful white jade, they're not finding more than 15 kilos a year there now, which is why it's costing something like $200,000, $300,000 a kilo just to buy in the rough. So they are still mining it, but Hotan has become a tourist centre now. Any really good jade never finds its way to the markets there. It's immediately sent to the workshops of master carvers, etc. What you have in Hotan is a tourist industry where they sell very poor quality product to the hundreds of thousands of tourists who go there every year, which is the same as with jadeite in other places as well. But so, yeah, they're still mining it. They're still looking for it because it's so valuable. So, for example, if you buy 2 bulldozers, which will cost, I think it's about 50 or 60,000 US dollars in China at the moment, and you rent a piece of land, and you just find a couple of kilos of really good jade, you're making money. But it does seem as though the government, Beijing, is now really looking at this again and examining it because it's just become like a tip. The whole river is just, it's so unsightly now that they're reconsidering whether to grant licenses anymore.
What projects are you working on now? Any more books in the pipeline?
I'm taking a rest this year from writing, and I'm concentrating a little more on carving. I'm slowing down now. I'm getting on in years. I'm approaching 70, and I'm starting to relax. I do have some quite interesting commissions from. This is interesting. So I've got 2 commissions from Western jewelry companies for jade jewelry. They're designing them, and I'm negotiating with them about, how to include the jade and carve the jade for them. And I think this is a sign of how much jade is beginning to pervade the consciousness of Western people as well. There's at least 2 of the big fashion jewelry retailers, who I won't name, who have started to include jade in their handbags and their jewelry designs. I have to say, and this is the reason I won't name them, because I don't want to be sued, and I'm sure you don't want to be sued, the jade they're using is extremely poor quality. Yeah, they're selling the name rather than the product itself. So I think it's becoming more and more interesting to Western buyers. I suppose an example of this is if you Google the word jade now, in the West, you'll get millions of hits on Google. When I first came to China in 2008, you might get 1 million hits. Now you get tens of millions.
All right, well, let's call it a night. It's getting late here in L.A., and you have your whole Sunday ahead of you there. Definitely a most enlightening discussion. I'd like to thank once again Mr. Andrew Shaw in lovely and historic Wuhan, Hubei province in the PRC for coming on the CHP. Not once, but twice. I've had the history of jade on my list of topics for over a decade, and now I could tick that one off the list. Thanks so much, Andrew, for explaining this world of jade to us.
My pleasure, Laszlo, my pleasure.
Okay, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California. I thank you all for listening, and you could be sure you're all cordially invited back again for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.